Korea's political uncertainty appears to be weighing down on its consumer confidence, with the latest findings showing a tangible drop. We have more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome. Hope you had a good Christmas celebration. It's Thursday, December 26th here in Seoul, and you're watching Press Perspective. Consumers' confidence in the health of the Korean economy dropped dramatically in December. For more on this, I have Andres Sanchez Braun with EFE Spain here in the studio. Andres, it's great to have you back.
Thank you for having us.
I also have Professor Kim Yong-jin at Sogang University with us virtually. Professor Kim, it's good to have you back too.
Good afternoon.
Right, Andres, we'll start here in the studio. Let's begin then with the details of the latest data regarding Korea's consumer confidence.
Yes, consumer confidence index for December dropped dramatically. The dip was the biggest since the pandemic. So basically the index in December stood at 88.4 points, which is already the lowest level since November of 2022. But the dip this time between this November and December was of 12, the drop was of 12.3 points. We hadn't seen such a steep fall since March of 2020. March of 2020, as we recall, was basically when COVID was starting to spread worldwide, and we were starting to see all these lockdowns. So fear of course, the economic impact was terrible. So I think that gives you an idea of what effect the whole declaration of the martial law and the whole current situation is perceived by Korean consumers, right? I mean, consumer confidence had been falling already consistently for the past 3 months in Korea, and especially since Donald Trump won the U.S. election, because of course, people anticipating that some of his policies might really hurt the Korean economy. But then again, the whole situation created by the short-lived martial law decreed by President Yoon is a big burden for the Korean economy. If we think about it right now, we're waiting for the Constitutional Court to decide if it actually ratifies Yoon's impeachment or not. So we don't really know if Yoon will be able to finish his term or not. And on top of that, today we're learning that the opposition is planning on impeaching the interim president, which is Prime Minister Han Duck-soo. So of course, in such an environment, it's just natural for many Koreans to not feel that they have to spend big, and of course, it's not the ideal environment for any risky investment at all.
Right. Professor Kim, Andres has touched upon this. What more can you tell us about the reasons behind the plunging confidence in consumption here in the country?
Right. Basically he explains very well, about the Korean situation better than me. Basically, the decline in the consumer confidence reflects growing concerns about the economic future of Korea, like Andres mentioned, which is already fragile with high inflation, high foreign exchange rate, sluggish domestic consumption, and rising household debt. The fragile economic condition of Korea makes it vulnerable to external shocks, such as the martial law declaration of President Yoon, even though it was short, and the predicted economic policies of the president-elect Mr. Trump, because Korean economy depends significantly on export for the economic growth. Trump said that he would impose the tariff on Chinese product up to 60% and additional levies like 10 to 15% on goods from other countries, including Korea, even Canada and Mexico, which are known to be its strong allies. His approach to tariff protectionism and the trade wars has fueled the fears of an adverse impact on Korean economy. In addition, Trump's stance on China's semiconductor industry will pose another threat to Korean economic growth, because Korea has been a major exporter of semiconductors to China. It was reported that the U.S. would prevent high bandwidth memory chips, which is used for AI development, from being exported to China. Korean semiconductor manufacturers like Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix will be affected. Any attempt of Trump to press Chinese tech sector could directly impact Korea's trade. A decline in export would likely suppress economic growth of Korea and further dampen domestic consumption. Moreover, the recent political turmoil caused by the martial law declaration by President Yoon negatively and deeply affected consumer confidence. These are the factors that cause fears of economic downturn in Korea among consumers.
Right. And Andres, the government, for its part, has been working to address various economic concerns, especially, as you mentioned, in light of the brief imposition of martial law here in the country. What can you share with us regarding the government's response thus far?
Well, actually, last week, Foreign Minister Cho Tae-yeol and Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok hosted a press conference for foreign media. And in that press conference, Finance Minister Choi basically insisted on what the government has been saying since the declaration of the martial law. We are going to try to use all resources available to try to make the economy as stable as possible, and also try to stabilize currency markets and the stock market. So what are some, for example, of these resources? Well, Minister Che was, for example, talking about a second round of value-up funds that are going to be injected into the Seoul stock market. Right now, there was a first round already injected of around 130 billion won. This second round is going to be bigger, 300 billion won, which is a little more than $200 million. This is being done because, of course, to try to cushion the blow the stock market is taking because of the foreign selling. A lot of foreign investors, of course, after the declaration of the martial law, suddenly thought that, of course, many Korean assets weren't really that safe in the current political environment, the so-called Korean discount that we've already discussed here many times. Of course, the other big concern for the government right now is the won and how it's depreciating heavily against the U.S. dollar. Today, actually, the won touched again another low. We hadn't seen levels like this since 2009. I mean, the drop of the won again had been the won had been consistently dropping since September. I believe you could buy a dollar for around 1,310 won back in September. Now you have to spend 1,465 won to get a single dollar. Of course, the dip had to do once again with Trump being elected as a president of the United States, and the fact that some of his policies might damage Korea heavily. But then just to get an idea of how the martial law that was implemented in December 3rd, in the past 20 days, the won has lost another 5% of its value against the dollar. And of course, the government is trying to reassure people, hinting at the possibility of if this fluctuation keeps happening, we're probably going to have to intervene and buy some won in the currency market to try to artificially value it up a little bit. So basically, that's what the press conference last week was for, to try to tell foreign media that the government is going to try do their best to
stabilize the financial markets.
Exactly.
Right. Professor Kim, even before the brief imposition of martial law, scholars here in the country had been calling for more efforts from the government to better address sluggish domestic demand. That being said, Professor Kim, what do you propose?
Well, I think there is nothing much to do at the moment because this political turmoil caused a whole bunch of problems. But anyway, we have to do something, right? So the most important thing the Korean government need to do at the moment is to boost up domestic consumption by using both fiscal policy and tax policies. The current government has been emphasizing the balance in national finance, which means, they don't want to spend taxpayers' money more than what is collected. But the situation is not like that, right? Of course, the expected deficit in the national finance this year will be over $50 billion. Even though we understand the expansionary fiscal policy, including supplementary budget, will be difficult to deploy, due to the declining, tax revenue this year. I think, Korean government need to make some of relief fund to give every individual citizen specific amount of money to spend, and also speed up the national procurement process to support SMEs, which, supply product and services to the government. This, national procurement market is over like $100 billion. So another thing the government need to address is micro business and SME problem. To give some relief to the sector, government may want to provide, more tax deduction to individuals who purchase products and services from micro businesses and SMEs.
Right. Meanwhile, Andres, you touched upon how the incoming Trump administration's trade policy is also affecting consumer confidence here. That being said, what more has been said by the incoming Trump administration with regard to its policy for trade with its global partners?
Well, I mean, the big problem here that Korea is facing stems basically from the uncertainty that a Trump administration carries, because we've seen what Donald Trump did in his first administration. He could say something on Monday and do the complete opposite on Tuesday. And of course, there's nothing worse in the economic field or the financial markets than uncertainty. And so, of course, the Korean economy faces the potential challenges, I'd say, in 3 or 4 different scenarios regarding the Trump administration. One, of course, is the fact, as Professor Kim was mentioning, what's going to happen with the tariffs. He's talked about maybe doing, like, is he going to go for an across-the-board blanket tariff of 20% for any foreign good that comes into the U.S.? Is it going to try to target Korea on a more specific, with a more specific tariff? Because we know that Trump has voiced his discontent with the fact that, the trade balance there's a deficit for the U.S. in its trade balance with Korea. That's one thing. Then the other thing, for example, that could affect Korean companies is all these companies that have invested heavily in the U.S., factoring in that they were going to get these very generous subsidy programs. And then we have a Treasury Secretary, Mr. Scott Bessent, who's actually voiced his concern with these subsidies. He doesn't apparently want to carry on subsidizing foreign companies. This, of course, could pretty much damage business for companies like Samsung Electronics, like SK Hynix, like LG Energy Solution, that have big interests in the U.S., right? Then, of course, an open trade war between China and the U.S. If the Trump administration decides to engage in an all-out trade war with China, there's the side effects that Professor Kim was already mentioning. If they're going to harden their stance on what kind of semiconductors you can export to China, these companies like Samsung Electronics, like SK Hynix, are gonna suffer a lot. And then, of course, if China and the U.S. are going to engage in such a conflict, both their economies are going to suffer. That means slower demands on their behalf. And these, we're talking about Korea's 2 largest trade partners. So right now, I think it's interesting, for example, what is the Bank of Korea going to do in the coming weeks and months? Because the country seems to be sandwiched between, like, a slowing China, Japan, which is Japanese economy is kind of lackluster, as it's been for the past decades, and it's also raising interest rates now, and then we have Trump coming. So in all this context and a slowing demand in Korea, and an inflation that suddenly is not reaching the 2% target after being way over 3% in the post-pandemic months, you would say this is an ideal situation for the Bank of Korea to cut rates. But of course, as Professor Kim mentioned, you have the problem of mounting household debt in Korea. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what the Bank of Korea is going to decide in terms of monetary policy in the coming weeks.
Right. Keeping in mind what Andres has just spoken about, the concerns that raised by Andres, Professor Kim, how should Korea, do you believe, seek to better navigate through Mr. Trump's tough tariff agenda and, of course, the concerns raised by Andres?
Well, like Andres mentioned, the situation is really, really like uncertain, right? They don't make it very clear. So I think they are very sly in maneuvering. maneuvering all the trade partners. But there is a simple rules. I guess the basic rule of the Trump administration in their foreign policies is a very transactional approach. I mean, give and take approach. In the sense, the first thing Korean government need to do is to identify the items to exchange with the U.S. For example, the President-elect Trump mentioned that the shipbuilding industry of the U.S. is very weak, so thus they need help from Korean shipbuilders. We can leverage the shipbuilding capability to get the tariff on automobile and semiconductors lowered. And Trump also asked the defense expense to be raised. If it is inevitable, we just give them the whole amount of money. We need to use the raise in the logistics cost sharing as a leverage to negotiate the amount of and types of tariff. There are lots of those areas to collaborate with the U.S., but the problem is that the Korean team has the capability to negotiate with the U.S. and also ready for the negotiation. I think, the current government or next government need to really, really clear about this.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Andres, the Bank of Korea itself, though, it claims that China's supply glut is a greater concern than Mr. Trump's tariffs for South Korean companies. Do explain this claim for us.
Yes, this report that came out recently from the Bank of Korea showed that many Korean companies actually thought that the current supply regarding Chinese exports is actually a more concerning matter than the Trump tariffs. Now, of course, they do have a point. As we were saying before, China's economy is slowing down, especially in terms of internal demand because of the slump on the real estate market. And of course, the Chinese government has heavily subsidized its exports sector, and now you're getting all these very competitive, cheap Chinese goods flooding the market. So of course, Korean companies are concerned about this. Now, is this the general perspective among all Korean companies? I really can't say that right now. But I think we can say that many Korean companies probably think this way because simply for the fact that so many enterprises in this country have been trying to anticipate if Trump was going to win the election. They've been planning for this possible contingency even since Trump lost the 2020 election. So they've tried to put everything in place to face this situation. And I think right now, yes, a big concern is what are we going to do with the cheap Chinese goods flooding the markets? We lose competitiveness, and Korea is basically a country whose economy depends a great deal in its exports.
Right, an export-driven country, of course, which is why, Professor Kim, Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok has recently warned that Korea's economic growth for next year will fall below the 2% range. Now, the BOK earlier on, though, forecast that next year's economic growth would be 1.9%, if I'm not mistaken. Do you share this grim outlook, Professor Kim?
Well, that's too bad, right? But I strongly agree to the view of the Finance and Economy Minister Choi Sang-mok about the economic outlook of Korea. Like we mentioned, the Bank of Korea has already reported a similar projection on the economic growth next year. I think there are three factors to consider when it comes to the outlook of Korean economy next year. First of all, due to the political instability caused by the impeachment process, as well as the economic downturn in Korea and other countries where Korean companies, export, the export performance of Korea won't be good. Korea as a country lost the international credibility due to the martial law declaration, which will negatively affect the intention to buy or invest of Korean buyers and investors alike. Secondly, domestic consumption won't revive soon. Employment has not been good. Household debt reached at the highest level, which puts lots of downward pressure on domestic consumption and real estate price. Finally, the real estate market, which is one of the core drivers for the economic growth of the Korea, has been frozen due to loan regulations with stress DSR being applied. If uncertainty grows due to the state of the emergency and impeachment circumstances, there might be delays in reconstruction schedules in the government-announced plans for sequential reorganization every year, which will lead to further drops in economic growth in the short term. One more big risk we need to consider is, like I mentioned, the Trump policy toward export to China. If he bans most of the strategic materials to be exported to China, Korean companies which export a lot to China will be in trouble, which lead to less performance in export, in turn, which also affect the Korean economic growth negatively.
Right, for sure. Andres, beyond South Korean borders, what do you suppose are the risks for the global economy next year?
Well, I could name four big challenges I'd say we should keep an eye on. Again, Trump, and Trump. That would be the first one because of all the whole uncertainty that him being in power carries, right? Then probably we should keep an eye on the war in Ukraine. Now that President Trump, that Trump will become the president on January 20th, he said he's going to put an end to the war very quickly. We'll see about that. There's also the situation in the Middle East, and now the fact that the Bashar al-Assad regime fell in Syria. We have another new unstable element in a very unstable region. We should also think of, for example, the political deadlocks happening in Europe's two biggest economies, in France and Germany. We have an upcoming election in Germany, and we have a very weak government in France with the threat of Marine Le Pen bringing down the government again. What's going to happen with that? It's key for the EU to have its two bigger economies nice and focused on what the EU needs to do now that Trump is coming into power too. And finally, I would say the slowing down of the Chinese economy, I think, is going to be an important factor. Is it going to keep through that course, or are we going to see a little recovery maybe? We'll have to wait and see.
Right, we don't know for sure for now, though. Well, I suppose we're going to have to end this session on that grim note. Andres, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thanks for having us
And
here.
Professor Kim, thank you so much for your insights.
Thanks for having me.
Right, well, that brings us to the end of Thursday's edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.